Well, good morning and welcome back to the Magical Mystery Tour. My name is Drew. I will be your tour guide for the day. As this week we are exploring, who do people really think that Jesus is? See, the magnitude of the claims that the New Testament makes about Jesus and that Jesus made about himself mean that we really have to answer that question seriously. It's not enough to just say, maybe he was a good teacher. We have to really consider if what he said was true. And throughout the world and throughout history, since the time of Jesus' life, people have wrestled with that question. What do we do with Jesus? Who was he really? Take some of the Eastern religions, for example, like Hinduism. In Hinduism, they're not going to believe that everything Jesus said was true. They're not going to believe all of the New Testament's claims. They're not going to say that he's God. But they like some of his teaching because it lines up with some of their teaching. And so Hinduism might say that Jesus is a guru, a wise man, perhaps one of the wisest gurus ever to live, but certainly not God. Or perhaps here in the Middle East. Well, we got a lot of things going on in the Middle East, don't we? Take, for example, Muslims of the Islamic faith. Now, they have their great prophet Muhammad. They have Allah, which they call God. But then what do we do with this Jesus character? And so in the Muslim faith, they actually will say that Jesus is another great prophet. Certainly he's not God. Certainly they would not call him Allah. But they can't deny the impact that he's had on the world, and so they claim him as one of their prophets. But you can see kind of the problem with that, right? Because Jesus didn't claim to be just a prophet of God. He claimed to be God. And if he really is, then you can't really hold him loosely as a prophet if he defamed your God by calling himself divine. In the same place, we have Israel, where the Jewish faith was founded. And when Jesus first came to earth, he came as a Jewish man. Now, the Jewish people believe in the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament. And they believe that he was so high above us, so far beyond us, that we could barely approach him, let alone be him. And so when this specific Jewish man shows up, Jesus, and says, I am God, well, they came after his life. And still today, now 2,000 years later, there are Jewish people who try to look at this and say, well, if he was a rebel, if he was a zealot, if they killed him and that should have been the end of it, why is this still around? So what do we do with Jesus? And some of them will say that, well, actually, he was a rabbi, a good teacher, perhaps one of the greatest teachers, but not God. Again, you see how that begins to break down, because if he really said he was God, would you listen to the rest of his teaching if he was wrong about something as important as that? And you know, we've got a lot of this kind of mixed together in our own culture. A lot of us feel like we'd be willing to say that I'll accept Jesus as a good teacher. I like some of his teaching. It's helpful to me. You know, love your neighbor, sounds good. Love your enemy, I'll try. But I don't know that he could be God. And how do we know that he really said that anyway? You see, the problem is we want to be just all right with Jesus, but the claims that he made about himself don't allow us to stay there. So this morning, we're going to explore the claims that the New Testament and Jesus himself make about who Jesus really is. Awesome, guys. Well, hey, if we are going to explore the claims of Jesus and the New Testament today, then we probably need to know what those claims are. If Jesus is going to be just all right, or if he's going to be something more than that. So here are the basic claims that the New Testament and Jesus himself make about who he was. First of all, this idea that there was some man, a human being in Palestine, a Jewish man who claimed to be God. That's the first, probably the foremost of the claims that he made. That a man in Palestine claimed to be God. Not only that, but number two, witnesses who lived at the same time as this man claimed that he did miracles. They claimed to see him walk on water, heal people, rise from the dead. Number 3, he convinced those closest to him that these things were true, that he was God, that he could do these things. And that would be easy, maybe easier, in an Eastern religion where, take the Japanese, for example, believed that the emperor was a man who was also a god. Or in the Greco-Roman society that Jesus lived in, where they believed the Caesar was a man, but also a god, except that those men died and stayed dead. Jesus claimed to have come back from the dead, to be risen again. And so the fourth thing is that not only did he convince those closest to him that he was God, but that hundreds of people saw him die and saw him raised from the dead. That's important because this isn't just one person saying, yeah, I got a friend who says he saw Jesus. What's his name? I don't remember. Well, what's his number? I'll call him. I can't find it. But trust me, my buddy told me, and he wouldn't lie. You wouldn't listen to that. But 500 people claiming that they saw Jesus alive. And fifth, that not only those hundreds of people, but the thousands of people that they spread the news to, that among them were many people who were willing to die to spread this news. Those are the claims that the New Testament is making, that Jesus is God and the one who can make us right with God. Now, based on the magnitude of his claims, based on what he claimed, it can't be right to be just all right with Jesus. We have to choose one way or the other. Either he is who he said he is, or he's not. And so any thoughtful person has to really look into this. We have to be willing to dig a little bit deeper, explore a little bit more, just simply based on the magnitude of the claim. So think about it this way. Let's say that the top law firm in all of Cincinnati gets in touch with you to let you know that, as it turns out, you are actually the heir of European royalty. Now, I know we've all gotten that email, right? And we delete it very quickly. We don't buy into that. But if the top law firm in Cincinnati, well, I might have to at least call them back, just based on where that claim is coming from and what a big deal it could be, how it could change my life. Or try this one on for size. The IRS gets in touch with you. They tell you that, as it turns out, you owe $400,000 in back taxes. See, in that moment, it's not good enough to doubt that that's really true. You better be sure, right? You better know for certain whether that's true or not, and you're going to follow up on that claim. Because that's a big enough claim that if you're wrong about it, it's going to ruin your life. You see, here's the deal with the things that Jesus claimed about himself. Based on the magnitude of the claim, we have to look into it because it has major implications for our lives and potentially for eternity. You know, Tim Keller tells a story about when he was in college in the 70s. And on their campus, they would set up microphones around the campus so that people could come and have public debate, either about political issues or things going on in the world around them. And he noticed one day that behind one of these microphones, somebody had set up a big sign, all black with white words on it that said, "The resurrection of Jesus is intellectually credible and existentially satisfying." Essentially, it's true and it's relevant. And Keller points out that those are really the two tests that any worldview, any philosophy, any major religion has to pass. It has to be both true and relevant. But a lot of times in our culture, when we approach Christianity, when we approach Jesus, you hear people say things like, well, I don't know if it's true, but it helps me. It's good to have something to believe in. It helps me know how to talk to my family, how to love my kids, and so I like some of the teaching. But here's the problem with that. If it's relevant like that, but it's not true, that's just a placebo. Like if there's really something wrong in the world, if there's really something broken in us, and all we're taking is a placebo, then we're not actually getting better. We're just tricking ourselves, right? So based on what he claimed, it can't be right to say it's not true, but at least it helps me. So I want to give us 3 reasons today that based on Jesus' claim, it's not all right to be just all right. Because either the whole thing is made up and he's a legend, or maybe he's just a liar, or other people around him lied about this. Maybe he was well-meaning and he had some good ideas, but he was just a lunatic. Or it's possible that it was true and he really is the Lord. So let's look at the first one of those. Reason number 1, if Jesus was just a legend. Legends are just all right with me, but they don't make me right with God. Right? If Jesus is just a legend, then I can't really base my life on anything that he teaches. I like legends: Zorro, Atlantis, Robin Hood, Johnny Appleseed, or my favorite, Paul Bunyan. These are great stories, right? You remember the story about Paul Bunyan? A giant, a man who is so huge with his big blue ox Babe, who is just as big as he was, and they go tromping around the wilderness and stomping all over the great land of Minnesota, leaving giant footprints that fill up with rain, and that's why it's called the land of 10,000 lakes. I remember the first time, because my family always goes to Minnesota on vacation every summer, and we spend time on a lake where my grandparents have a cabin. And so I remember the first time I heard that story, and I thought, oh, that's how it happened. So as a kid, totally ready to buy into the legend of Paul Bunyan. In fact, my parents actually took us to this Paul Bunyan theme park, where they had a statue of Paul Bunyan that I know it was probably like 50 feet, but it felt like 500 to a kid. And I'm standing here, and I'm looking at, I met Paul Bunyan. He really is as big as the stories say. Right? And I'm standing in front of this statue, and I'm talking to it. Hi, Paul. And this booming voice comes back. You'll have to speak up. I can't hear you way up here. Now, to this day, I have no idea if there's somebody sitting in there with the megaphone who really couldn't hear me, or if it just says that to everybody as a joke about how big he is. But I was totally in, right? So imagine, took me a couple of years, but imagine a couple of years later when I realize that's not Paul Bunyan at all. That is tin shaped like a man with a speaker in his mouth so the kids can have some fun. But it's just a legend. Right? From that moment on, there is no part of me that wants to base anything about my life, about the way I lead my family, about my career, definitely not about my eternity, on a statue who can't really hear me that good. If Jesus is just a legend, no offense, we are all wasting our time this morning. If we like his teaching, but everything else about him was kind of made up later on, as people looked back, his followers kind of added stories, then we're really wasting our time here, because I don't want to stake my life on something that was really just a legend. And so one of the objections that people can bring to the New Testament is, how do we know that he really said that? Before we even talk about if it's true, how do we know that people actually claimed these things happened, that people really thought this was true, and that it wasn't just legend made up after the fact sometime later? Well, a scholar named A.N. Sherwin White responds to that in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. And in the interest of avoiding confirmation bias, it's important to note that White is not a Christian. But as he studied this, he discovered what biblical scholars have also discovered, that the bulk of the New Testament was written within about 20 years of the time that Christ lived and died. And a lot of it, like the Gospels, were written within 2 or 3 years, that people wrote these things down and began sharing them with one another. And here's why that's important. Because if you're going to make up a legend, you really need to wait until all of the eyewitnesses are dead. You see, because then you can start to introduce stories, and there's nobody who can tell you that didn't happen. So if there was a real man named Paul Bunyan, and I met him last week, and this week I told you he's 500 feet tall, someone else would say, I know Paul, he's probably 5'10". Right? There'd be too many eyewitnesses to tell you that that's not real. So this is what White says. Using the writings of Herodotus, Sherwin White maintained that it takes the passing of at least 2 generations before myths can develop, be introduced and remain in the record of a historical figure. Right? Because 2 generations later, anybody who could refute it would be dead. When Sherwin White considers the New Testament Gospels, he says that for the Gospels to be fables, the rate of legendary accumulation would have to have been unbelievable. Not unlikely, but literally unbelievable, because there would be too many people who could refute the claim, who would not take your copy of this book and tell anyone else about it because they were there and they know it wasn't true, unless it was. So not only was there not enough time that had passed, but it's also not the right genre. You see, if we object to it and we come back to the New Testament and say, well, I don't believe that it's really history. I believe it's more like moral stories with some good moral teaching. The problem with that is that you really have to throw out the whole thing then, because the New Testament itself does not say that it was written as legend. The Bible claims to be written as history. In fact, we see that through a lot of the details that are introduced in the stories in the Bible. Things that only would have been written in as history to make sure that we knew the details of the situation, the kinds of names and people and places that show up in the Bible are meant to be proof that this happened when and where and how it's recorded. So even little details. When Jesus feeds 5,000 people with a very specific 5 loaves and 2 fish, those kinds of details are indicative of historical writing. Or when a woman who's caught in adultery is brought before Jesus, and it says that he's writing in the dirt. It doesn't tell us what he's writing, never mentions it again, but this detail is written as if somebody was actually watching it happen. Now, we're used to seeing those kind of details in fiction because in about the 1800s, people started writing what we would now call a novel. Realistic, novelistic fiction, where you get all kinds of these details. The man turned the knob slowly as he opened the door, just a crack, to see if any light would come through. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with the plot, but it kind of sets the scene, gives us the atmosphere. But people didn't write that way before Jesus' time, during Jesus' time, or after Jesus' time until about the 1800s. And so this is what C.S. Lewis says about it, because he was not only an author, but also a literary scholar. Either these accounts are reports of actual events, or else some unknown writer in the 2nd century, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole universe of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. The point being, that genre didn't exist, and the Bible claims to be history. As Princeton professor Bruce Metzger points out, because of these kinds of things, not enough time, not the right genre, today, no competent scholar denies the historicity of Jesus, the fact that he did exist and that he claimed these things. And not only is it because there's not enough time passed for legends, because it's not the right genre for legend, but also that he could not be a legend with all of these footnotes. I mentioned the people, the names, the places that would be brought in. In ancient history, those were written in as footnotes, as resources that you could go back to verify this for yourself. Eyewitnesses who could follow up on this claim. You see, this is very different than some of the other world religions. You think about Islam, for example. Muhammad goes up on a mountain by himself and comes back with everything that should change the rest of your life. Why? Was anybody else there? Did anybody else hear the voice of Allah? Did anybody else? No, it was just me, but just trust me on this. You see, with the New Testament, there's footnote after name of other people who were there that at that time you could go and say to them, did you really see this? One example of that in the book of Luke. Luke wrote out the story of Jesus' life, and he was a doctor, a well-educated man who in his own book says, I have interviewed everybody I could find. I have asked them every tough question because I want to make sure that if we're going to base our lives on this, we can really believe it. And so all throughout his book, he has moments like this. This comes after the resurrection of Jesus, when these women that are about to be mentioned had seen Jesus risen. It says they remembered his words, then they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. You see, so if right after that they returned from the tomb and told all these things, told that they saw Jesus, who we all saw die on the cross, we know he was buried, and you saw him alive again? Who saw him alive again? I'll tell you who. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. These are people that you can follow up with right now. But they're not just anybody. They're not just some guy that Drew knows. But I want to highlight one for you. Joanna. Joanna is actually the wife of King Herod's chief financial officer, Chuza. Chuza would have been like the Warren Buffett of his day, the man who just knew how to move all the money around. And so claiming that his wife saw Jesus, all right, not only is this a prominent person that you can easily go and find, but also there's a lot on the line for these people if they're going to say, yes, I believe that. In fact, Chuza had such a high position of authority that he would have managed all of Herod's money, the building of all of his palaces. And I'll give you one example, a palace that Herod had built called the Herodian, where they wanted it to be on a mountain, but they didn't have a mountain, so they built a mountain. Literally made a man-made mountain so they could put his palace on top. $1 billion project by today's standards. And Chuza would have overseen all of the movement of that money. And his wife, Joanna, witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. She wasn't the only prominent figure who was listed there. We see more in the book of Acts and in the book of John. In the book of Acts, the apostle known as Paul went before a couple of people that would be similar to Supreme Court justices today. People who were responsible for the truth. People who were responsible for the rest of the people. One of them being Festus, and one of them being King Agrippa. And look at how he speaks to them about what he believed about the claims of Jesus Christ. He said, I am not mad, I'm not crazy, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason, for the king before whom I also speak freely knows these things. For I am convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. You see, what Paul is saying is, this was not done in secret. This was not done in hiding. This isn't one person who goes back into a little room and writes up a story and tries to think if this sounds believable and then trick everybody into it. He says to Festus, I'm not crazy, and you know I'm not, because the king saw this too. You know these things that people are talking about. You've heard these claims. You've seen it happen. Others include Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who are mentioned in John 19. Notice it says, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body of Jesus, and Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. They took his body off the cross to prepare it for burial. But who are these people? Joseph and Nicodemus. You notice that it says Joseph did this secretly because he feared the Jews. Nicodemus came to Jesus by night. And the implication might be that they feared the repercussions because they were extremely prominent people. In fact, Joseph of Arimathea was so individually wealthy that from other historians we have learned that he could, just from his own estate, maintain the entire city of Jerusalem for 10 years. And Nicodemus was similar. He was the greatest rabbi, the greatest teacher that the people had. Now, if Nicodemus started saying that this other Jewish guy is God, he had everything to lose. And from other historians, we discover that he did, in fact, lose everything. But he was willing to because he believed that the claims that Jesus made were true. You see, because although they did it in secret and came by night at first, now, hey, you're written in the book, brother. Anybody can ask you, did you really believe that? Did you really see that? You understand, if you say yes, your whole world could fall apart. Your whole world could change. And they said, yes. You see, this is a whole lot more than legend. Because the people were actually there to see it. Think about it this way. If I came to you and said, you remember when the Berlin Wall came down? You remember that? There was so much division in Germany. But finally, by an act of God, a tornado came through and ripped the wall apart and reunited that nation again. You remember that? Remember that tornado? Of course not. Right? If I told you that and I tried to pitch it as truth, you would be like, is this a joke? I'm not exactly, where are you going with this? Oh, that's not what I meant. I meant not a tornado. It was the kind and benevolent aliens who came down to teach us peace and love. And they knew that the Berlin Wall would be a great symbol of that. And so they tore it down with their laser beams. Probably you leave before I even finish that part, right? Because that was only like 25, 30 years ago. We remember that. I remember seeing that on TV. We know how it happened. You're not going to listen to any legends from me. You're going to go ask people who saw it, or you're going to know for yourself because you were there. So if it's not a legend, if these things weren't made up, if Jesus really taught these things about himself, well, maybe he was just a liar. Reason number 2, that liars are just all right with me, but they don't make me right. I mean, do any of us really want to say that? That I think Jesus lied about some of what he was saying. He couldn't be God, but I will live my life by some of his other good moral teachings. I mean, that in itself just breaks down. And yet, we hear that a lot in our culture, that people critique Christians because they just can't live up to what Jesus actually taught. We critique the church because it just doesn't seem to match with everything that Jesus said. As hard as they try, it just seems like... But then when we look at Jesus himself, when we let Jesus speak for himself, Tim Keller puts it this way. He says that we're surprised by his perfection. There's some part of us that even if we have a hard time believing this stuff, we kind of want to believe this stuff. We want to buy into this because we see that it works. And man, he lived it. That he had tenderness without weakness, strength without harshness, humility without the slightest lack of confidence, holiness and unbending conviction without lacking approachability, power without insensitivity, passion without prejudice, harshest judgment on self-satisfied, yet the most winsome kindness to the broken and the marginal. Never inconsistent, never a false step. Jesus had too high of an ethic for us to go back and call him a liar. It makes me think of a friend of mine who thinks this way, and I didn't realize it at first, but we used to play basketball together, and he's such a mentor. He's always looking for younger guys to take under his wing and kind of gear them up, train them up, teach them how to be a man, how to be a dad. And I noticed that I was trying to do the same thing, and I was trying to speak to them like stuff that I had learned in here that had just changed me and changed my family, and it just had seen how awesome it had made my life. And guys, I just want to share some of this with you. And when I would start talking that way, my friend James would back me up. He would affirm this stuff that I was bringing from Jesus. And it was strange because I knew James was not a Christ follower. And so one day as we're walking out of the gym, I just kind of asked him about it. I said, help me out here. It's weird to me that we are online with so much of the same stuff until I found out why. Because actually we were both basing the way we lived our lives off of Jesus' teaching. The difference was that James did not believe that Jesus was God. He liked the Bible. He liked the teaching in it. He believed it was helpful for living his life and helping others live their lives. But he didn't really think that the God of the Bible was the real God or that Jesus could be him. Sure, he might be out there, but I don't think this is it. You see the inconsistency there with saying that the pages of the Bible are full of lies about who Jesus is, but I am going to apply this part to my life and help others do the same. You see, it falls apart. C.S. Lewis puts it this way. He says, I'm trying to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. that is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level of the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. It was not in Jesus' plans for us to be able to think that maybe he was just a good teacher. And on top of having too high of an ethic, there are too many martyrs for this to have been just a lie. You see, Jesus was able to convince the people closest to him that he was God. The people who saw him all the time, people who slept in the bed on the other side of the same room, to see him as he went to sleep, as he woke up, as they traveled with him, just waiting for any minute, any time when, just once, Jesus would say one of those words, right? That Jesus would just punch a guy in the face for calling him a demon. Just any moment where Jesus would slip up and we could say, man, I knew it. You're human like the rest of us. And yet, they never saw it. So they believed he was God. The people closest to him saw the way that he lived his life, heard the things that he taught, and believed it. And not only the people closest to him, but hundreds more who saw him risen from the dead, and thousands more who they shared it with, on down through history, until millions, even billions of people have been affected to believe the truth of what Jesus claimed. You see, the truth is that people who claim divinity, and we hear those from time to time, right? Every once in a while you see something on the news about some weird dude with some cult over in the middle of somewhere who says that he's the Messiah, says that he's God and everybody should gather around him. But they've always been unable to convince more than a small group of probably unbalanced, definitely disenfranchised people. And it always falls apart when they are either arrested or they die, and it disintegrates. But not with Jesus. Because Jesus claimed that he would rise again. People claimed that they saw it, and they believe him. And instead of disintegrating with his death, it spread with his resurrection. So that we're still sitting here today talking about him. So if he's not a legend and he can't be a liar and still be a good teacher, then reason number 3 is, well, maybe he was well-meaning, but he was just crazy. A lunatic is just all right with me, but it doesn't make me right. It can't make me right with God. It can't make me right in my life. In so many places, Jesus claims these kinds of remarkable things. He claimed that he would come back from the dead. He claimed that he could walk on water, that he could heal people, that he was God, that he lived before time began. One of these comes in Luke chapter 10, where Jesus talks about lightning. And notice this conversation. He had just sent out his followers to do some of his work, and they come back and say, Jesus, we were actually able to cast out demons. It's crazy. It's amazing. And look at how Jesus responds. Oh, you cast out demons? I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Now, if you remember us talking about the devil a little bit last week, this is Jesus saying that I was there before time began, and I saw this happen. Sure. Right? Now, if I came to you, this would be like me saying, oh yeah, I remember when Washington crossed the Delaware, I told him, George, you're going to make it, man. Just go. You don't believe me. I couldn't possibly have been there. And yet Jesus claims to have been there. And now if I came to you and said, hey, did you see the Cavs game the other night? 49 points in the first quarter, a finals record. Man, I saw that. That was amazing. You could say, yeah, I saw that too, because we were actually there. That's how Jesus talks about this moment from before time began. Like, oh yeah, I saw the Cavs game the other day. I was there. See, that's because Jesus actually claims to be Lord. Not a legend, not a liar, not a lunatic, but Lord. And if we look at John 8, we see how the Jews came against him because of what he was claiming. And sometimes people object and say that, well, did Jesus really claim that he was God? Well, he did, and let me show you. This is what the Jews responded to him. They said to him, we were not born of fornication, the implication being that he was. We have one Father, God. Now we know that you have a demon. All right, they're calling him crazy. Abraham is dead, and the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death? Are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead? And the prophets are dead? Who do you make yourself out to be? Look at how Jesus answered. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it, and was glad. Then the Jews said to him, you are not even 50 years old yet, and have you seen Abraham? Now watch how Jesus answers. Most assuredly. Right now, in this moment, as you stand before me, whether you believe me or not, let no one tell you that I didn't say this. Let no one tell you that this was made up later. I want you to hear me right now to know for sure what I am about to claim. Most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now you notice that I am is all in capitals. The reason for that is because the name that God gave to the Jewish people, the name that he said, this is how you will call me, was Yahweh, which means I am. In fact, the Jewish people were so careful with his name, they actually came up with a variation of it that they would use in conversation. They would refer to God as Jehovah. It's actually the consonants from Yahweh with the vowels of another name, Adonai, put together, so that when they would speak to each other, they could say Jehovah and not accidentally profane the name of God by using it in the wrong way. Similarly, when they were writing, if they were writing something and they had to write the name of God, they would leave the vowels out, just the consonants, and they would use a different pen. Because I can't write God's name with the same pen that I write regular words with. That's how careful they were about the name of God. And now here stands Jesus saying, I am. I am God. I was before Abraham. I was before time began. I am the spark that set the universe in motion. I am. That he claimed to be God by his death and resurrection to make us right with God. That everything that we've done or could ever do could be forgiven, covered by the sacrifice that Jesus made because he claimed to be I am. That's why, based on what he claimed, it can't be all right to be just all right with Jesus. The magnitude of his claim means that we better not doubt that he's God. We better know for sure, or we better dig into this a little more, because we really only have a couple of options. Either we fear the kind of crazy influence he's had and reject him, or we love the Savior that he tells us he is and respect him. Either we fear and reject him, or we love and respect him. So let's go back to that song. Let's go back to that song, Jesus is Just All Right With Me. I think I first knew it as a Doobie Brothers song, but they weren't the first ones to record it. Actually, the Byrds recorded it before them. But did you know the Byrds weren't the first ones to record it either? There was actually a man named Arthur Reed Reynolds, and he recorded this song with the Art Reynolds Singers in 1966. Show of hands, Art Reynolds Singers fans. It's kind of what I expected. Okay, so he writes the song in 1966 actually as a worship song. In fact, the lyric that Jesus was just all right was meant to be in the vernacular of the day to indicate that Jesus is amazing and spectacular. So you might say it something like this. I'll take my best crack at it. Hey, you know that Jesus? Man, Jesus is just all right. And we're done with that. We're not doing that again. But that's what he was saying. That's what the song was meant to mean. And so when it was picked up by the Byrds and then the Doobie Brothers actually added this piece into the song where it slows down and they sing, Jesus, he's my friend. Jesus, he's my friend. He took me by the hand far from this land. Jesus, he's my friend. You see, Jesus doesn't want us to just think he's a good teacher. Jesus wants us to know that he is God, that he wants to be our God, that he wants to lead our lives and be our friends, to help us make the music we were designed for. As we move from being the lead to taking the lead from the Jesus who is who he says he is. You see, I think for many of us, the idea of getting serious about Jesus, it's a little bit scary. You know, we fear that we're going to lose our edge, that we're going to become some kind of weird version of ourselves. But Jesus wants to make us the best version of ourselves. A version of ourselves where we can love and work with other people, but also love and work with God. As we learn that there's a difference between being the lead bassist, drummer, keyboards, vocalist, to taking the lead from someone who can help us make the best music possible. Hey, let me pray this for us. God, would you help us to make the best music possible as we learn not to be the lead, but to take the lead from you. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Hey, thank you for being with us this week. We will see you next week for Father's Day and more of the Magical Mystery Tour. Thanks for coming.